The dust of Redemption's single street is a living thing. It rises in choking clouds under the hooves of spooked horses and settles like a shroud on the unpainted planks of the buildings, on the sweat-stained hats of the men who loiter in the slivers of shade, and on the spirit of anyone who lingers too long. Today it tastes of cheap whiskey and cruelty. Elias Thorne feels it coat his tongue, a gritty reminder of why he avoids this town, preferring the stark, honest solitude of his ranch nestled against the foothills. But his salt is low and the flour sack is nearly empty, and a man can't live on jerky and regret alone. He stands outside the saloon, the bat-winged doors sighing open and shut, belching out the sound of tinny piano music and coarse laughter. It's the laughter that makes him pause, a sharp, predatory sound that scrapes at something raw inside him. Then he sees her. She's being led by a rope, not around her wrists, but around her neck. She is Apache, her dark hair unbound and tangled with dust, her deerskin dress torn at the shoulder. Her face is a mask of stoic defiance, but Elias, a connoisseur of silent suffering, sees the tremor in her jaw, the flicker of terror in her dark, deep-set eyes. The man holding the rope is Jedediah Slade, the saloon's owner, a man whose gut hangs over his belt and whose smile reveals teeth stained brown with tobacco. "Got a real prize here, boys," Slade bellows, his voice oiled with self-satisfaction. "Caught wandering near the crick. Good for cooking, cleaning, whatever a man needs." Who'll start the bidding for a prime piece of savage help? A wave of nausea rolls through Elias. This isn't a cattle auction. It's a debasement, a spectacle of human misery for the entertainment of bored, cruel men. He sees her chin lift a fraction higher, a silent refusal to break before these jackals. He thinks of his own spread, silent save for the wind and the lowing of his small herd. He thinks of the empty chair across his hearth, the quiet that had long ago curdled from peace into a profound, aching loneliness. He looks at the woman, at the raw rope burn on her neck, and a switch is flipped deep within his soul. It is an impulse born not of desire, but of a decency he thought had long since been weathered out of him. He moves before he can think, his worn boots scuffing a path through the jeering crowd. He feels their eyes on him, the lone rancher, the quiet man who keeps to himself. He steps into the saloon's foul-smelling shadow. Slade's eyes light up, smelling a customer. "Thorne, didn't figure you for this kind of sport. What'll it be? $20 for a strong back." Elias ignores the question. His gaze is fixed on the woman. He sees the fine bones of her face, the proud set of her shoulders despite the indignity. He sees a person, not property. And with two words that feel both foreign and inevitable on his tongue, his life and hers are irrevocably changed. "I'll pay. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe." The saloon grows quiet. The piano player's fingers falter on the keys. Slade's greasy smile tightens. He was hoping for a bidding war for sport. Elias's quiet declaration has stolen his stage. "Pay what?" Slade sneers, yanking the rope slightly. The woman stumbles, but doesn't cry out. "What you pay for the rope," Elias says, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "And $100 to forget you ever saw her." A collective gasp ripples through the onlookers. $100 was a fortune. It was more than Elias could afford, a sum that would cripple him for a year, maybe more. It was a stupid, reckless, insane amount. Slade's piggish eyes narrow, calculating. He sees the iron in Elias's stare. This wasn't a bid. It was an ultimatum. Greed wins out over pride. "Done," Slade says, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boot. He let the rope drop. Elias doesn't flinch. He pulls a worn leather pouch from his coat, the weight of it familiar and now terribly light. He counts out the coins and worn bills onto the filthy bar, the sound of each one landing like a nail in the coffin of his financial security. He doesn't look at the money. He looks at the woman, who is now watching him, her expression unreadable, a mix of shock, suspicion, and a sliver of something he can't name. He picks up the end of the fallen rope, not to lead her, but to discard it. He tosses it into the dust. Then, with a quiet command that cuts through the thick, judgmental silence of the saloon, he says, "Come on." The ride back to his ranch was a study in silence. The Apache woman sat ramrod straight on the spare horse he'd bought on credit he didn't have, her hands gripping the saddle horn with white-knuckled intensity. She rode well, her body moving with the horse's rhythm as if she were born to it, which she probably was. Elias rode slightly ahead, the set of his shoulders a rigid line of tension. He could feel her gaze on his back, heavy and questioning. He could also feel the lingering glares of the townsfolk as they departed. The sheriff, a man named Barlow whose spine was made of jelly, had watched from his office, his face a mask of weary disapproval. He'd done nothing to stop Slade's grotesque auction, and he'd do nothing to help Elias with whatever trouble was sure to follow. Elias's ranch was less a sprawling enterprise and more a stubborn foothold on an unforgiving landscape. It was nestled in a small valley, flanked by rust-colored mesas that clawed at the vast, indifferent sky. A small, sturdy cabin he'd built with his own hands stood beside a weathered barn and a series of corrals. A creek, his property's lifeblood, cut a meandering path through the cottonwoods nearby. It was a lonely place, a kingdom of one, and for 5 years that's how he'd liked it. Or so he told himself. The silence in the cabin had been his companion since Martha died. The fever had taken her in 3 short days, leaving him with a half-finished cradle and a silence so profound it had its own sound, a high, keening hum in his ears. He'd buried her on the hill overlooking the creek, and then he'd buried himself in work. The ranch was his penance, his distraction, his entire world. The loneliness was a familiar ache, a phantom limb he'd learned to live without touching. Now, as he dismounted and watched the Apache woman slide from her horse, a new kind of silence descended, one that was shared, electric, and fraught with uncertainty. He gestured toward the cabin. "Food," he said, the single word feeling clumsy and loud in the quiet air. She didn't move. Her eyes scanned the horizon, lingering on the distant, hazy line of mountains that marked the beginning of Apache territory. She was a captive still, he realized, just in a different cage. He had paid money for her. In the eyes of the world, in her own eyes, what did that make him but a different kind of owner? The thought soured in his gut. He let out a slow breath and tried again, softening his voice. "You're safe here." Her dark eyes snapped to his, and for the first time, he saw not just fear, but a flicker of fierce intelligence, of assessment. She was judging him, weighing his every move. He deserved it. He had participated in a transaction for a human life. No matter his intent, the act itself was stained. He led the way into the cabin, leaving the door open behind him. The interior was sparse but clean. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a small kitchen area, and a bed in the corner. His bed. To the side, a door led to a small storage room, barely large enough for a cot and a few crates. He'd built it for supplies, but it had ended up holding Martha's things, her sewing basket, a stack of books, a small cedar chest. He hadn't opened that door in 5 years. He opened it now. The air that drifted out was faintly scented with lavender and dust. He pulled out the narrow cot and set it up near the hearth, as far from his own bed as the small space would allow. He laid a clean, woolen blanket over it. He turned to face her. She stood just inside the doorway, a sentinel of distrust. He pointed to the cot. "For you," he said. Then he pointed to himself and his bed in the corner. "Me." He hoped the gesture was clear, a division of space, an offering of privacy she hadn't had. She watched him, her expression unchanging. He sighed, feeling the futility of it. He had acted on a moment of righteous anger, and now the consequences were standing in his house, looking at him as if he were her executioner. He turned to the stove, busying his hands by stirring the embers and adding fresh wood. He put a pot of water on to boil for coffee and sliced thick pieces of bacon into a skillet. The familiar actions calmed his frayed nerves. The smell of food filled the small space, a scent of domesticity that felt alien and poignant. When he turned back, she had moved. She was standing by the open door, looking not at him, but the rolling plains that stretched out from his valley, looking toward home. And for the first time, Elias Thorne felt the crushing weight of what he had truly done. He hadn't just bought a woman. He had stolen a daughter from her people and shackled himself to a future he could not possibly predict. The first few days passed in a strained, suffocating silence. Elias spoke only when necessary, using simple, single words. Water, eat careful, she, in turn, spoke not at all. She moved about the cabin with a quiet, spectral grace, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floorboards. She ate what he offered, small, deliberate bites, her eyes always downcast. She slept on the cot, wrapped tightly in the blanket, and was always awake before him, sitting silently by the cold hearth as he stirred. He tried to establish a routine that felt less like servitude and more like cohabitation. He would do his chores, mending fences, tending the cattle, chopping wood, and when he returned, exhausted and grimed with sweat, he would find she had done something. The first time, it was the tin plates, washed and stacked neatly. The next, a tear in his work shirt had been mended with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She never did them when he was watching. The tasks were simply completed in his absence, small, silent offerings of labor. He didn't know if it was gratitude or a captive's instinct to make herself useful to survive. The ambiguity gnawed at him. One afternoon, he returned to the cabin to tend to a gash on his forearm from a slipped axe. He was washing it at the basin when she approached. He tensed, but she simply pointed at the wound, then at a small leather pouch she now wore at her waist. He hadn't seen it before. She must have had it hidden in her dress. He hesitated. Trust was a currency neither of them possessed. But the cut was deep and already beginning to feel hot and tight. He gave a curt nod. She opened the pouch and took out a pinch of dried leaves and what looked like a fine powder. She mixed them into a paste with a few drops of water from the basin. Her movements were deft and sure. She gestured for his arm. He extended it, his muscles tight with apprehension. Her fingers were surprisingly gentle as she cleaned the edges of the wound. He watched her face, bent in concentration. There were fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, but her expression was serene, focused. She applied the poultice. It was cool at first, then began to sting with a clean, antiseptic heat. When she was done, she wrapped his arm with a strip of clean cloth from his supply box. Her touch was impersonal, efficient, and yet it was the first time another human being had touched him with anything resembling care in 5 years. The feeling was so foreign, it was unnerving. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. She met his gaze for a fleeting second, and in that instant, he saw a flicker of something beyond the fear and suspicion. It was a deep, weary pride, a healer's pride. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, then retreated to her side of the cabin. That small act began to thaw the permafrost between them. He started leaving tasks for her that were suited to her skills. He brought the neglected patch of ground behind the cabin back to life with a shovel and hoe, and he left a few packets of seeds, beans, squash, corn, on the table. The next day, he saw her kneeling in the dirt, her hands skillfully creating neat rows, planting the seeds with a practiced rhythm. She was creating a garden, a small patch of life in the harsh landscape, an act of hope. He discovered she had a profound understanding of the land. She seemed to know which plants were edible, which were medicinal, and which were to be avoided. One sweltering afternoon, he was lamenting the creek's low level when she led him up into the rocky hills behind the barn. She walked a winding, seemingly random path, pausing to listen, to observe the direction of the wind, to touch the face of the rocks. Then, in a small, hidden fissure masked by overgrown brush, she pointed. A trickle of clear, cold water seeped from the rock, a hidden spring he had lived beside for years and never known existed. He looked from the life-giving water to her, and a wave of awe washed over him. She was not just a survivor. She was a part of this land in a way he, with his fences and his brands, would never be. He began to see her not as the woman he had saved, but as a person of immense skill and hidden depths. He started calling her Nita, a name he'd heard one of the men in the saloon sneer. He didn't know what it meant, but it felt better than the silence. When he first said it, she looked up, startled, but she didn't object. It was another small shift in the foundation of their strange new world. His life, once a monotonous cycle of work and solitude, now had a new rhythm. He found himself watching her as she worked in the garden, her dark hair gleaming in the sun. He would listen for the soft scrape of her spoon in the cooking pot as he cleaned his tools in the evening. Her presence was a quiet hum that had started to fill the hollow spaces in his life. The feeling was terrifying. It was a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself since Martha. He was becoming attached, not just responsible, and that meant he had something to lose again. The fragility of their peace was shattered a month after her arrival. Elias was reinforcing a corral fence when he saw the dust cloud on the horizon. 3 riders. He knew before they were close enough to see their faces. His gut went cold. He grabbed the shotgun he always kept propped near the barn door and stood his ground, waiting. It was Jedediah Slade and 2 of his usual cronies, men with mean eyes and lazy smiles. They reined in their horses just outside the corral, their smirks oozing contempt. "Thorne," Slade said, his eyes flicking past Elias to the cabin. "Just making a friendly neighborly visit. Seeing how you're getting on with your new property." The word property hung in the air like a foul smell. Elias's grip tightened on the shotgun. "She's not property," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And you're not welcome here. State your business or ride out." Slade chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "My business? I'm worried about you, Thorne. A man alone out here with a savage. It ain't right. It ain't safe. For you," he added, letting his gaze linger on the cabin door again. "Maybe she'd be better off back in town. More comfortable. I'd be willing to take her off your hands. No charity." The implication was clear and vile. Elias felt a white-hot rage build in his chest, a fury so pure it was almost calming. He cocked the shotgun. The double click was deafening in the sudden silence. "She is under my protection," Elias said, each word a chip of ice. "The next time you set foot on my land, I'll consider it trespassing with intent to do harm, and I'll respond accordingly. Now, get." Slade's smirk faltered. He saw the look in Elias's eyes, the dead calm certainty of a man who had nothing left to lose and had just found something worth defending. He exchanged a look with his men, then spat on the ground. "Have it your way, Thorne, but don't come crying to us when you wake up with your throat slit." They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a trail of dust and malice. Elias stood there until they were just a speck on the horizon, his heart hammering against his ribs. He slowly uncocked the shotgun, the adrenaline leaving him feeling shaky and cold. He turned and saw her standing in the doorway of the cabin. She had been watching the entire time. Her face was pale, her dark eyes wide. She had seen him stand for her, not as an owner defending his investment, but as a man defending another person's honor. For the first time since she had arrived, the wall of suspicion in her eyes seemed to crumble, replaced by a look of profound, startling understanding. But the confrontation left a scar. That evening, the easy quiet between them was gone, replaced by a heavy, anxious silence. Elias was grim, the reality of his situation pressing in on him. He had made an enemy of Slade, and by extension, the town. They were truly alone now, an island in a sea of hostility. Nita retreated back into her shell, the men's violent threats a stark reminder of her trauma. He saw the question in her eyes. "Was I worth it? Do you regret this?" He wanted to tell her no, that he would do it again in a heartbeat. But the words wouldn't come. How could he offer her reassurance when he had just invited so much danger to their door? The fragile sanctuary he had built felt like it was made of glass, and Slade had just thrown the first stone. The days following Slade's visit were tense. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. Elias worked with a feverish intensity, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges that bordered his property. Nita was quieter than ever, her movements taut with a nervous energy that mirrored his own. The silent companionship they had begun to build felt fragile, threatened by the ugliness that had ridden into their valley. One evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky. Elias sat on the porch, cleaning his rifle, the methodical task a small comfort. He saw Anita kneeling by the garden, not tending the plants, but tracing patterns in the soft earth with a stick. He watched for a while, his curiosity piqued. They weren't random doodles. They were deliberate, symbolic shapes. Circles, arrows, figures that looked like mountains and rivers. He walked over, his boots soft in the dirt. She looked up as he approached, her hands stilling. He crouched down, careful not to disturb her drawings. He recognized one of the symbols, a jagged peak with 3 smaller peaks beside it. He'd seen it etched on a rock near the territorial border, a landmark on an old, broken treaty map he'd once seen in a marshal's office. It was a marker for a specific clan's territory. He looked from the drawing to her face. A dawning realization, cold and immense, settled over him. He had assumed she was a lone woman, lost or cast out. A nobody. But these symbols were a language, a map, a claim. She wasn't a nobody. "What is this?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She watched him for a long moment, her eyes searching his. The air was still, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of a cow. She had kept her voice locked away, a treasure too precious or too dangerous to share. Now, she seemed to make a decision. She pointed to the jagged peak she had drawn. "My home," she said. Her voice was low, raspy from disuse, but the English words were clear, accented but unmistakable. Elias was stunned into silence. She could speak his language. She had understood everything. His clumsy attempts at communication, the taunts in the saloon, his stand against Slade. She had held her silence as a shield. He slowly processed the implications. "You have been holding back." She gave a small, sad nod. To speak is to give away power. To be silent is to be safe. It was a devastatingly simple truth of her existence. He looked at her, truly seeing the depth of the chasm she had been forced to navigate. Then she drew another symbol next to the mountain, a stylized hawk with its wings outstretched. She tapped it with her finger, then looked him square in the eye. "My father," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "He is Chiricahua. He is a chief." The air rushed from Elias's lungs. A chief, not just a warrior, but a leader, a man of power and influence, a man whose daughter had been stolen, sold like an animal in a filthy saloon, and was now living on a white man's ranch. The trouble he was in had just magnified 1,000-fold. Slade and his cronies were a pack of coyotes, dangerous but manageable. An Apache war chief searching for his daughter was a wildfire, an earthquake, a force of nature. He had thought he was protecting a lone woman. He now realized he was harboring a princess, and her father's kingdom was likely on its way. The weight of it was crushing. He looked up at the darkening ridges surrounding his small valley, and his blood ran cold. He was no longer just a lonely rancher. He was a key figure in a drama that could get him and her killed. The revelation hung between them, heavy and unspoken. He was a fool, a well-intentioned, reckless fool. He had blundered into tribal politics, into a world of honor and blood feuds he could not begin to understand. Later that night, unable to sleep, he stood on the porch, the cool night air doing little to calm the frantic beating of his heart. A storm was gathering in the west, distant lightning silently illuminating the bellies of the clouds. He looked toward the high ridge to the north, the one that overlooked his entire property, and he saw it. A flicker of light, too steady for lightning. A fire. He stared, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. As he watched, another light bloomed into existence a few hundred yards to the east of the first, then a third to the west, and a fourth farther down the ridgeline. They were campfires, deliberately, strategically placed, a chain of silent, watchful eyes materializing out of the darkness. They weren't coming for him. They were already here. His small, isolated ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fishbowl, and from the darkness on the ridge, the Apache had come to stare. The tribe hadn't just found her. They had surrounded him. The night passed in a state of suspended terror. The fires on the ridge burned with a steady, unnerving patience. They were not the wild, leaping flames of an attacking force, but the controlled, watchful embers of a patient one. It was a siege of the mind. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep, every hoot of an owl like a signal. Elias sat in a chair by the hearth, his shotgun across his lap, his knuckles white. Across the room, Nita sat on her cot, a still, silent figure wrapped in her blanket, her face turned toward the window. She was watching the fires too, waiting. Sleep was impossible. The cabin, once his fortress of solitude, now felt like a trap. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and utterly, hopelessly alone. The townsfolk would not help him. They would likely cheer his demise. He had one shotgun, a rifle, and maybe 100 rounds of ammunition against what could be an entire war party. It was a fight he could not win. As the first pale, gray light of dawn began to creep over the eastern mesas, diluting the darkness, Nita finally spoke. Her voice cut through the thick tension in the room. "They will not attack." Elias turned to look at her. Her face was calm, her expression resolute. There was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, somber certainty. "How do you know?" he asked, his own voice a hoarse whisper. "If they wanted us dead, we would be dead," she said simply. "They did not travel through the night to announce themselves with fires. This is not war. This is a council. A council." The word did little to soothe him. "A council for what?" "To see," she said, her gaze drifting back to the window. "To watch. To judge the man who holds the daughter of Black Hawk." Black Hawk. She had given him a name. It sounded like a force of nature, like a storm front or a rock slide. Elias felt a fresh wave of dread. He was being judged by a man named Black Hawk. "What are they judging?" he asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. "They saw you in the town," she explained, her words coming more easily now, as if the crisis had unlocked the dam of her silence. "Our scouts. They followed me since I was taken. They watched the saloon. They watched you pay the money. They do not understand. They see a white man buying an Apache woman. To them, this looks like slavery. They are here to learn if you are an enemy, or something else." Something else. The phrase hung in the air. What was he? A rescuer? A fool? A man who acted on an impulse and was now facing the consequences? He looked around the small cabin, at the signs of their shared life, the mended shirt, the garden patch, the hidden spring. He had tried to do the right thing, but in their world, from their perspective, his actions were deeply ambiguous, deeply suspect. He knew then that this could not be solved with a shotgun. The fires on the ridge were not a threat to be met with violence, but a question to be answered with honor. They were running out of time. Their food and water wouldn't last forever, and his nerve was already fraying. "What do we do?" he asked, the question a genuine plea for her wisdom. He was out of his depth, a stranger in his own home. Nita stood up, her movements fluid and decisive. The fearful, captive woman he had brought from redemption was gone, replaced by the daughter of a chief. "I will go to them," she said. "I will speak to my father. I will tell him what I have seen here." Elias's heart seized. "Alone? Nita, they might not see you as one of them anymore. After being here, with me," he couldn't bring himself to say the ugly words, but they both understood the implication. She could be seen as tainted, a traitor. "It is a risk I must take," she said, her chin high. "It is the only way." He looked at her, at the fierce bravery in her eyes, the resolve that seemed to radiate from her small frame. She was willing to walk into that camp and face judgment to save them both. And in that moment, his own path became clear. The fear that had been strangling him for hours receded, replaced by a simple, stark clarity. He stood up, placing his shotgun carefully against the wall. "No," he said, his voice steady now. "You won't go alone." She turned to him, her eyes widening in surprise. "I started this," he said, meeting her gaze. "The day I walked into that saloon. My actions brought them here. I'll face them with you. I will answer to your father myself." He was offering to walk, unarmed, into an armed camp of men who had every reason to kill him. It was the most reckless thing he had ever considered, far more so than spending his last $100. But it was the only thing to do. He would not hide behind her. He would not let her face her people alone. His protection of her could not end at his fence line. It had to be absolute. A new understanding passed between them, silent and profound. This was no longer about a rancher and his charge. It was a partnership, forged in shared fear and a mutual, unspoken respect. They would face this council together, whatever the outcome. The sun was fully risen, casting long shadows across the valley floor when they opened the cabin door. The air was cool and crisp, alive with the scent of sage and damp earth. Elias left his shotgun and his rifle inside. He had only his integrity left, and a weapon would only signal that he did not trust it to be enough. Nita walked beside him, her back straight, her head held high. Together, they stepped off the porch and began the long walk toward the northern ridge, toward the silent fires and the judgment of Black Hawk. The walk was the longest of Elias's life. With every step, he felt the weight of 100 unseen eyes upon him. The Apache warriors remained hidden among the rocks and junipers, their presence a palpable pressure on the air. There was no sound but the crunch of their boots on the dry earth and the frantic beating of his own heart. He expected an arrow, a shot, a war cry at any moment. But nothing came. They were being permitted to approach. Nita led him toward a natural amphitheater formed by a cluster of large boulders. As they drew closer, figures began to emerge from the landscape. They were not the wild, screaming savages of Slade's drunken stories. They were lean, hard men with dignified faces and watchful eyes, their bodies adorned with simple leather and beadwork, not war paint. They held bows and rifles, but held them loosely at rest. This was, as Nita had said, a council, not an ambush. At the center of the gathering stood one man who was clearly the leader. He was older than the others, his face a roadmap of desert sun and hard wisdom, his long, gray-streaked hair held back by a simple leather band. He was tall and broad-shouldered, radiating an aura of immense authority and stillness. He watched them approach, his black eyes missing nothing. This had to be Black Hawk. They stopped a respectful distance away. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Elias's throat was dry as dust. He could feel the collective hostility of the warriors, a low hum of suspicion aimed directly at him. Finally, Black Hawk spoke. His voice was deep, resonant, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. He spoke in his own tongue, the words sharp and questioning. A younger warrior standing beside him, his face a mask of cold fury, translated. "Our chief asks why you are here." The warrior translated, his eyes boring into Elias. "He asks why the white man who paid money for his daughter now walks into our camp, as if he has a right to be here." Elias swallowed hard, gathering his courage. He looked directly at Black Hawk, man to man. "I came because I have nothing to hide," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "And because your daughter should not have to face you alone to answer for my actions." Another torrent of Apache words from Black Hawk. The translator sneered. He asked about the money. "Did you think you could own the wind? Did you think a handful of your metal discs could purchase a daughter of the people?" This was the heart of it, the question he had been asking himself. He let out a slow breath, choosing his words with more care than he had ever chosen anything in his life. "No," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. "I saw a woman being treated like an animal. I saw a crowd of men laughing at her pain. My world, my laws, offered her no protection. In that place, at that moment, money was the only weapon I had to stop a great evil. I did not buy a slave, Chief. I paid a ransom. I paid to stop a wrong. I wanted nothing from her in return." He paused, letting the words settle. "Your daughter has been a guest in my home. She has owed me nothing from the moment she arrived. She has been free to leave at any time. My only wish was to offer her a safe place to heal from what my people did to her. If that is a crime in your eyes, then I am guilty." A murmur rippled through the assembled warriors. Black Hawk's expression remained unreadable, his gaze unwavering. He turned his eyes to Nita. He spoke to her then, his voice softer, the words flowing in a gentle cadence. It was the voice of a father, not a chief. Nita answered him, her own voice clear and strong. She spoke for a long time, her hands gesturing occasionally toward Elias, toward the small cabin in the valley below. Elias could not understand the words, but he understood the tone. She was not just explaining, she was testifying. She was telling her story. He saw the cold fury on the translator's face soften into confusion, then grudging respect. He saw the other warriors listening intently, their suspicion warring with the undeniable truth in her voice. She told him everything. The rope around her neck, the jeering crowd, the quiet rancher who had stepped out of the shadows. She told them of the $100, a sum she now understood was ruinous for him. She spoke of the separate cot, the gentle way he'd tended her wound, the shotgun he'd leveled at Slade, not to keep her in, but to keep evil out. She told them of his silence, his grief, the profound loneliness that clung to him like a second skin. She spoke of the honor of a man who lived by a code they could understand, a man who, despite being her captor's race, had shown her more respect than any white man she had ever met. When she finished, a profound silence fell over the amphitheater. The judgment in Black Hawk's eyes had been replaced by a deep, searching contemplation. He looked from his daughter's proud, defiant face to the solitary white man standing before him, a man who had risked everything for a principle. He saw the unspoken bond between them, a connection forged not of ownership, but of mutual decency in a cruel world. Finally, Black Hawk gave a single, curt nod. The ordeal was over. The tension broke like a fever. He spoke again, and the young warrior translated, his voice now devoid of its earlier hostility. Our chief understands. He sees that your heart is not crooked. He accepts that you acted with honor. The warrior paused. He thanks you for protecting his daughter. Relief washed over Elias, so powerfully his knees felt weak. He had survived. They had survived. Black Hawk then took a step forward and spoke directly to Nita. He was giving her a choice. The translator confirmed it. He says your place is with your people. You're free to return with us now. But, the warrior added, looking at Elias, he says that if you found a new path, the choice is yours to walk it. He will not force your hand. This was the final test, and it was not for Elias, but for her. Her freedom, absolute and unquestioned. Nita looked past Elias, her gaze sweeping over the familiar mesas, the land of her birth, the faces of her family. Then, her eyes returned to the valley below, to the small, lonely cabin with a plume of smoke rising from its chimney. Her entire life, her past, and her potential future lay balanced on this precipice. She looked at Elias, a long, searching gaze that held the weight of everything they had been through. He held his breath, prepared for the inevitable pain of her departure. He had done what he set out to do. He had set her free. That had to be enough. Nita turned back to her father. She spoke a few quiet words in her language. Then she walked away from her people, back toward him, stopping just a few feet away. The Apache warriors, led by their chief, began to melt back into the landscape as silently as they had appeared. Black Hawk gave Elias one last, long look, a look of understanding, a look that acknowledged a debt between two honorable men, before he, too, was gone. The sun was high in the sky, beating down on the silent valley. They were alone again. Nita stood before him, her silhouette framed against the vast, empty landscape. She had not gone with them. She had stayed. He followed her back to the ranch, his mind reeling, his heart a chaotic drum in his chest. He didn't understand. He didn't dare to hope. They walked in silence, the air thick with everything that had just happened, with everything that was yet to be said. She stopped on the edge of the porch, turning to face him. The sun caught the glint of unshed tears in her eyes, but her voice, when she spoke, was steady. I told him, she said, her English clear and deliberate, a gift she was now freely giving him. I told my father that a person's home is not always the place they were born. It is the place they are seen. She took a small, hesitant step closer. My path is here now, with you. Elias felt something inside him, a wall he had built around his heart 5 years ago, crumble into dust. He had stepped into a saloon to save a stranger from bondage, and had, in turn, been rescued from a prison of his own making. The crushing loneliness he had carried for so long simply evaporated in the warmth of her gaze. The threat from the tribe was gone, replaced by an unspoken peace treaty, an understanding that transcended race and language. The threat from redemption remained, a shadow on the horizon, but Elias no longer felt he faced it alone. He had an ally, a partner. That evening, they sat together on the porch steps, not in the strained silence of strangers, but in the comfortable quiet of companions. The sky exploded into a symphony of fiery color as the sun dipped below the mesas. Nita was mending a piece of leather tack, her hands moving with a familiar, soothing rhythm. Elias watched her, the simple domestic act filling him with a sense of peace so profound it was almost painful. The ranch was no longer a monument to his grief, and it was no longer her gilded cage. It was a shared space, a sanctuary they had defended and won together. It was a home. She looked up and caught him watching, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile touched her lips, reaching all the way to her dark, expressive eyes. He smiled back, a real smile, one that felt rusty and new all at once. He had walked into town, a lonely rancher, and paid $100 for a stranger's freedom. He looked at the woman beside him, at the quiet strength and profound decency that radiated from her, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had received far more than he had ever given. He had found his own. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.